So what if we made our spaces more livable, our communities more communal, our lives more free? What if we try to solve these problems together? For those who, I don't know, stumbled in from the street, hi, my name is Andrew Sage. I'm a writer from Trinidad and Tobago, if you couldn't tell by my accent, and my lack of comfort with the cold, complete discomfort with the cold. I've run a YouTube channel called Andrewism for the past 5 years. I don't know, you all watch my YouTube channel? Right, and as we all know, having a YouTube channel makes you an expert. But seriously, today I just want to have a chat about what Solarpunk is, what anarchism is, and how they relate to the idea of social revolution, and how that can inspire some tangible change, what you can do here now. So, show of hands, how many of you have heard of Solarpunk? Okay, a good portion, pretty much most of the people here. But for those who aren't familiar, it's a lot of different things, a lot of different people. It's a literary genre in some cases, it's a visual language, it's a living, breathing international movement. It's a way of imagining our collective futures and also a way of actively creating it. And I hope there are train fans in the audience because we're going to hear the train throughout our time here. But it's a great ambience, I would say. So above all, though, it is a vision. Beyond the limits of capitalism, beyond the rift in humanity and nature, beyond what to avoid and toward what to hope for. It's a story of a positive future. It's a story of a positive future with a focus on environmental sustainability, on autonomy, and on social justice. It is something that explores the intersections between humanity, nature, and technology, and I believe that it has the potential, already partially realized, to realize a real movement, to rally a real movement for change. To me, Solarpunk, I stumbled upon it very early on as a youth, and it was something that was like an aha moment. I'm sure it's an aha moment for a lot of people because it's like, oh, I'm not crazy. I'm not like, imagine, like the way we're doing things right now sucks and we could be doing better. And it doesn't have to be in the realm of just Studio Ghibli and, science fiction. It's something that can happen. And I know that it's difficult in some cases because our imaginations have been very much restricted by the status quo. I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar with the concept of capitalist realism, which is the idea that, that capitalism is so pervasive and so infectious into our minds, pretty much. It's hard to imagine any alternative or any way out. This is what there is. And more broadly, I think there's also a sense of authoritarian or hierarchical realism. This idea that the only way that we can relate with each other is with this sort of stratification, this inequality, this sense of putting others above and below others. And so it's like we're cut off from any vision of any other world and any other way. It's like this is it. And every narrative that we experience, every story, every pop history is sort of telling us that this is all we have. This is all we've ever been. That our lives are meant to be nasty and brutish and short. And so to break out of that, where I think Solarpunk is powerful, is that it stimulates our imagination through both nature and through narratives. Nature-wise, I think we see the potential in Solarpunk to really draw from the diversity that is present in nature. We've in a lot of cases, it's been in quite a war against nature, with a lot of our monocultures and monopolies and all these, I like this alliteration a lot, so I repeat it, these man-made monotonies that we experience in our day-to-day lives. That's just an ongoing barrage or assault on nature. And I've been guilty of it too. I've had dengue before, so if I see a mosquito, it is on site. But but I will say that the way that we have structured our habitats, because the city, the urban space, it is a habitat, has created a very out of equilibrium space. And so that's where we have the prevalence of what we would call pests, because the the natural regulations would be there for those pests are not necessarily present. And so just sort of finding ways to draw upon the inspiration of nature and how ecosystems are meant to function through things like rewilding is something that I consider particularly valuable and important to the development of Solarpunk. I think another aspect of it is looking at biomimicry, this idea of copying the practices and the designs of nature in how we shape our spaces. And so you've seen a lot in Solarpunk art. You have like some Solarpunk art is extremely sci-fi, extremely fantastical for sure. But you do get that kind of idea that we could take a look at these old practices, these vernacular practices, the ancient practices that have also drawn inspiration from nature's wing designs or their patterns or their furs or whatever the case may be. And also I think Solarpunk really benefits from the just peace that comes in being in nature. It's very easy to get in this sort of fast-tracked lifestyle, which is like live and work and go and go and go and go, commute, traffic. But when you get a moment to, and it's unfortunately in many cases a privilege to stop and just be in nature, to take a moment to reflect, to feel the grass between your toes, to touch grass. It's really something special to experience it in all your senses. It does something psychologically that unfortunately many of our day-to-day lives are bereft of, but I think Solarpunk very valuably encourages us to return to. I think also on the other side of the potential or the stimulation of imagination that Solarpunk provides is through narratives. Narratives in the sense of the stories that we tell. Oftentimes we are surrounded by dystopia and dystopian tales, the ways things could get bad and even worse. Or we are surrounded by narratives of apocalypse, whether it be of a religious variety or a scientific variety. But I think Solarpunk dares to imagine something even better. And of course there are many ways you could look at Solarpunk. I know some people see Solarpunk as a sort of almost optimistic post-apocalypse. I do see it that way sometimes as well. But I think the value of Solarpunk is that it is a genre of sci-fi in many cases in one of its interpretations, and because it's that genre, you sort of have that element of what we could aspire to. We see that throughout the sci-fi genre. Of course there's a lot of sci-fi that I wouldn't aspire to for sure. I think I do have some aspirations for a space like Star Trek, but then also I wouldn't want to live in give me an example of a Blade Runner. Yeah, I would not want to live in a Blade Runner or an Altered Carbon or any kind of scenario that is so prevalent as Cyberpunk 2077. Not my cup of tea. But I think the power of sci-fi being something that we are able to aspire to is that if you look at how some of the early sci-fi developed with this idea of humans becoming a spacefaring species, that idea that became so powerful and potent in sci-fi led a lot of people to say, hey, I want to be an astronomist, I want to be an astronaut, I want to do something that can contribute to humanity seeking its destiny in the stars. And whether or not we have a destiny in the stars is up for debate. I think we have some stuff to sort out down here first. But just that idea of yearning towards the stars and the stories of sci-fi giving us something tangible to strive towards is something I think that Solarpunk has the potential to tap into as well. And if we can sort of get into the zeitgeist in the same way that sci-fi, spacefaring sci-fi has got into the zeitgeist, then we could potentially see children growing up saying, I want to be a permaculturist. I want to be, like a techno, like hacker, bringing down corporations or whatever the case may be. And of course, there are sci-fi books and stories already that are sort of permeating, that have come to be associated with Solarpunk. Solarpunk is relatively new in terms of the conversation. It got its start in like the 2010s. But we do have stories that we have come to associate with solarpunk in certain circles. So we have like Parable of the Sower, we have like The Dispossessed. Well, Parable of the Sower is kind of dystopian, probably not a good example. But books like The Dispossessed or The Fifth Sacred Thing, or recently Becky Chambers' Monk and Robot series. For those who have read it, the two books, very fun, very cute, very comfy fiction. But of course, I don't want to just get tied up in speculations of what we can do in nature, or what we can do with nature, or speculations of what stories we can tell, because there are things we could do to make solarpunk something that is taken and acted practically. Things like urban food forests. I heard that there are some projects like that taking place both here in Portland and in Seattle and in other places. So shout out to all the people involved in that. There are also projects related to community microgrids and maker spaces and tool libraries. And all of these things are necessary components. They're sort of the seeds of what could flourish and could become a really fantastic solarpunk society. The appeal to solarpunk to me comes in, of course, in those aesthetic principles, the idea of how we can reclaim the vernacular architectural practices that we have lost. I was talking to somebody as I was driving through here, and we were having a discussion about the ways that the houses here have been built, particularly the early houses in the Victorian style, and how prior to the advent of central heating and these sort of systems, they had to design homes in a way that made sense for all the seasons. So you had to orient windows in a particular way, and you had to choose the right materials. And we see that everywhere in the world, in cold regions and in hot regions. And that doesn't even just apply to architecture, that applies to the way that people dress themselves as well. I always remark at the clownery, the absurdity of the way that, as a colonized nation, Trinidad and Tobago, where I come from, we walk around in, I'm going to need somebody to translate this to Fahrenheit, but we walk around in 34 and 35 degree weather in suits. 96. It's like 96 degrees Fahrenheit. It makes no sense, right? But I mean, that's item number 1,000 something of things you could blame the British for, right? I'm in a room full of Americans, so I know you'll have we have some shared rivalry there.
I believe you mentioned tea.
Yeah, well, I do love a good tea, but the Brits have appropriated that as well. But yeah, just looking at the way that we dress ourselves even, and taking a look at ways that would make sense. We've gotten into this whole sort of fast fashion epidemic where we have so much disposable, discardable clothing, and it's like we could do more with that. We could create our own clothing in ways that our ancestors have done for thousands of years. But we've lost these skills, we've been de-skilled, and become dependent on these sort of consumerist systems. But I digress a little bit. So we've taken a look at the vernacular architecture, the vernacular clothing, the idea of renewable energy, the practices of permaculture, the appeal of community and of third places, of diversity and accessibility, of finding ways to ensure that everybody has something to bring to the table. This idea of complementarity, I think, is very vital. It's the idea that we treat non-hierarchical differences as something to celebrate and integrate rather than something to use to divide and to separate. And of course, although it's not necessarily a political philosophy in content, solarpunk does lend itself to politics. It's something that various political ideologies have picked up on, adopted, something they could strive towards. It's been associated online typically with movements like communalism, democratic and federalism, neo-zapatismo, anarchism. Often from the outside, of course, people are applying these labels, these movements, but there's a reason that all those ideologies are typically associated with solarpunk. And in particular, I want to look at the meaning of anarchism and how that anarchist tie to solarpunk or how anarchism can serve as a tie to solarpunk and can serve as a way to materialize many of these ideals and practices. Which brings us to the next section of this talk. I'm going to ask a really silly question, considering where I am. How many of you have heard of anarchism? Right, I am in Portland. I mean, come on. But for the sake of those unaware or unfamiliar, anarchists have a lot of different takes on anarchism. I'm going to have a take here on anarchism, and then, hopefully nobody comes at me afterwards like, no, it's actually this interpretation of anarchism. It's like, you Bakuninist or you Malatesta. You're just like, no, I follow the Kropotkin school of thought. But I'm going to have a take on anarchism, and then, you put 10 anarchists in a room, you're going to have 21 different takes. So we'll go with my take, and you're free to disagree, free to have your own interpretation. I mean, that's kind of anarchism's deal. But I think there's one thing that is in common, that it is non-negotiable, and it's this opposition to authority. The definition that I have sort of built up over time, because I think it has a lot of explanatory power, and I kind of use it as a way to structure some talks, is that anarchism is the political philosophy and practice that opposes all authority along with its justifying dogmas and proposes the unending pursuit of anarchy, a world without rule where self-determination, mutuality, and free association form the basis of our society. And I have it written down because it's a very thick definition, but we're going to break it down piece by piece. I speak of anarchism as a philosophy and a practice because it's both a way of seeing and a way of doing, right? In fact, some only want to see it as a way of doing, and I get that. But as a way of seeing, it's really something that's meant to guide your analysis of our conditions. It's a way of looking at, it's a lens. It's not the only lens. I don't think it should be your only lens of looking at the world. But I think it's a very valuable lens because it takes a look at the ways that our relations and the ways that, in particular, that authority affect the development of society, the interactions between people, the development of our technology, of our culture, all these different things. And also, as a philosophy, it's something that can guide your approach to change, can guide your approach to relating with other people, and can just guide your approach to life. There's some people who take a very philosophical approach to anarchism, where it's just like, it's almost like a sort of a very personal philosophy for them. But of course, it's not just a philosophy, it's not just something on the inside, it's also a practice. It's something that many anarchists have said that it's something that you do rather than something that you are, the late David Graeber being among them. And it's really in that sort of interpretation, doing everything you can in how you approach your interpersonal relationships and how you organize and practice in ways that reflect those anarchist principles. And of course, I'm going to say this again in the talk, but there are no perfect anarchists. But I think that anarchists are those who strive to embody that way of relating with others to the greatest extent possible, that way of engaging with others as equals in seeking not to dominate and exploit, but in seeking ways to cooperate and to draw from the benefits that each of us has to bring to the table.
Yeah!
Thank you for that, yeah, because now I can drink water. And I think that's a point of contention, because you always say water. Right, but it does have a T in it. So another part of the definition is this idea that anarchists oppose authority, right? But a lot of people end up asking, what do you mean by authority? Because are you saying like you're not going to listen to doctors? Are you saying that like you're not going to engage in any kind of like self-defense or revolution, whatever the case may be? But that's the thing about authority. Like a lot of words in the English language, it has a lot of different definitions depending on context. And so I think it's very important to establish exactly what anarchists mean when they're talking about authority. Because it is, for example, sometimes a synonym for expertise, but the kind of authority that anarchists oppose has nothing to do with expertise. It's not about, taking in and respecting the study and the knowledge of people who know more than you in certain areas. It's not about force either. Violence and force are often associated with authority, but they're not by themselves the source of authority. They can be a mechanism of defending authority, but in itself they don't constitute authority, and you can just as easily use them to resist authority. I often look at the whip of the slave master in the hands of the slave master is a tool of authority, and in the hands of the slave it's a means of liberation. Finally, it's not coordination, and I think it's very important to separate authority from this concept of coordination, because for one, it's definitely tied up in authority in a lot of the ways that organizations are run today. They have a very strict sort of hierarchy of command, a pyramid structure in a lot of organizations, and the role of coordination is often tied up in that. But I think one of the most fascinating aspects of anarchist organizing in practice is finding ways to coordinate the very special individuals that everybody is, and working out how we get them to work together without dominating. And that sort of communication of information, that sort of shared responsibility and approach to navigating people in all of their quirks and strength and everything. So specifically, authority is talking about the recognized right above others to give commands, to make decisions, to enforce obedience, to control property, and so on and so forth. And we speak of authority as a right because it is very much a privilege or priority that is recognized or enforced above others. Authorities have the rights to command upon the underlings, the right to enforce the obedience of the underlings, the right to control the properties the earth has been carved up into. And you probably see this in your personal life and your own experiences with authority. If you are being beat up by a police officer, for example, you have a right to swing your fist and defend yourself. You could go to jail because they have the right to shoot and to jail you. You don't have the right to live in an empty home because the landlords, the banks, the state, they have the right to evict you. Right? You don't have the right to travel as you please because governments have a right to cut up the earth and box you into their borders. And thank you, Mr. Train. This aspect of authority is something that I recognized very early on. From a very young age, I found it extremely unfair because I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the power disparity between passports, but there is a vast disparity. Somebody born in Yemen or Palestine or the Congo or Bangladesh or Bhutan, any one of these places, Bolivia, Trinidad and Tobago, our access to the countries of the world visa free is very, very, very stark in its difference. I had to get a visa to be here. I've had a visa, thankfully, for most of my life. Of course, something you have to renew. But I hope in this talk I don't put it in jeopardy, right? But I've always found that aspect particularly frustrating because it's like, I didn't choose to spawn in Trinidad. I love Trinidad. I love the food. But because I was born in Trinidad and Tobago, there are so many places that are just closed off to me. Not necessarily completely closed off. You can still apply for a visa, but that's the thing, you can apply, and then if they decide, you know what, I'm not feeling like giving you a chance today, they can deny you. And the fact that this authority has the right to just cut you off from roaming on a planet that nobody creates, nobody bought, nobody has the rights to own. And we all just got here. Most people, I think, were born less than 100 years ago, and this earth is several billion years old. So, what gives you the right? And then, of course, and this is also very visceral for a lot of people, you and your co-workers are exploited at work because the owner has the right to direct and profit from your collective force. Your collective force being the things that you produce as a whole that nobody could produce alone. So the idea of collective force and exploitation is just really the idea that each of us as individuals, let's say we're all pushing a box, right? 10 people together pushing a box. All 10 people pushing that box is how that box is able to move. One person pushing that box could not push that box. And yet, for some reason, we have this system where somebody can push the box alongside other people, and yet their benefit far supersedes the benefit of others. Or one person could sit on a chair and lean back and watch as other people push a box and say, yeah, you know what, thank you. Give me that. And so that sort of exploitation is derived from the right of authority. The desires of authorities overrule your own. But even with all that, you might be asking, like, why even oppose authority at all? I mean, yes, it exploits us. Yes, it controls our lives. Yes, it restricts our access to our needs. Yes, it holds us back from reaching our full potential. But besides all those things, why? But I think I pretty much answered the question. I think if you're the type of person who's already questioning why things are the way they are, you're probably already drawn to anarchy. If you don't take that's just the way things are as an answer, or any of the other justifications of authority, I think you're already halfway there. Like, almost nobody believes this now, and I say almost nobody because, for one, I try not to speak in absolutes, and for two, there are a few weirdos on the internet who do still ascribe to this, but, I mean, I'm going to ask this. Show of hands, who still believes in the divine right of kings? Really? Nobody? Okay, call me a heretic, but I petwee at the divine right of kings, the idea that, this person has been ordained by God or ordained by the universe to lord over all. And most of us have discarded that idea. There was a time when the idea of that being discarded was pretty much inconceivable. Shout out to Ursula Gwynn for that quote. But we've gotten here, where we can. But I wouldn't say that I danced I danced in celebration at the end of a certain Queen of England. But it's certainly a time for them to step down gracefully, at the very least. But there are other justifications out there. The idea of this, social contract theory. I know some of you have heard of this. I popped out of my mom a couple of years ago, and in that time, I don't think I ever was approached with a contract. And if I did sign a contract with like my baby thumb or whatever, I certainly haven't had an opportunity to rescind my consent to that contract. There's no, opt-out form that I could fill out to say I'm done with this. Every corner of the earth pretty much has been carved up by these systems. There are small pockets of reprieve for sure, but those pockets are often in very precarious circumstances, and that's by design. And there really is no meaningful escape. So I don't abide by the social contract theory personally. There's also the justification of natural hierarchy, right? The idea that we evolved for this. You have a lot of the sort of pseudoscientific justifications for the separation of people into classes or genders or races, or the religious justifications that this is how men are, this is how women are, or some cases that kind of mixed up between the religious and the pseudoscientific, the ideas of the curse of Ham, that black people were like destined to be enslaved because some old guy saw his father naked in a tent, some like mythological tale. So there's that justification. Obviously, I also discard that. There's also the justification that authority is necessary for order, that's needed for efficiency, that you need to have, this one way of doing things. And I get it. I 100%. I play a lot of like City Skylines and like Civilization and those kinds of games, which is quite ironic, I know. But I do like, putting things in order, in a sense, playing those sort of God games and stuff. But at the end of the day, those are just games. And in reality, for when they're set up in ways that give you the kind of information to make those kind of decisions, when in reality, a lot of those positions of authority are often cut off from a lot of the métis, a lot of the grounded knowledge that is necessary to make informed decisions. The sort of experience and practice, the on the ground scope and perspective that is necessary to sort of organize and coordinate our lives in ways that are more beneficial to the whole rather than beneficial to the interests of particular authorities. This idea that authorities needed to maintain order, I get it. It can definitely be frustrating trying to organize things sometimes or coordinate things sometimes when everybody kind of wants to do their own thing. But even if it's difficult, even if it's something that we're not practiced in, I certainly see the value, and I certainly see the historical example of the ways that people, when given the opportunity to practice and the freedom to exercise their capacity to organize cooperatively, are capable of far more than many of us can even imagine.
Yeah.
Oh, good, thank you. I'll get to that. So we'll have a Q&A a little bit later on, and we can get into that sort of thing. But here's the thing, right? Authority only exists because, as a whole, people agree to it, implicitly or explicitly. If tomorrow, if overnight, everybody stopped obeying presidents and kings and billionaires, their power would evaporate in an instant. I wish that it could happen overnight. It's not going to happen overnight. But I think it's important to recognize that so much of their power is just derived from obedience, from apathy, from systemic inertia, and from just like a lack of knowledge that there is any other way of doing things. But of course, as I have been going in all sorts of different directions with the definition of anarchism, but there's more to anarchism than just the negation of authority. Right, there is a positive side to the definition that I spoke about. And I think it's important that the definition of anarchism includes what we're for, what we imagine and hope to build, just as much as what we're against. So I said in the definition that anarchism proposes the unending pursuit of anarchy, a world without rule where self-determination, mutuality, and free association form the basis of our society. I think the unending pursuit element is a very important part of that definition. It's not like, all right, pack it up, we reached anarchy, everybody could go home now. It's ongoing, it's a strive. It's not like some perfect utopia that we reach and just stagnate within. In fact, it's not even assuming that people will be perfect anarchists. I don't know any perfect anarchists. I'm not sure if any of you know any perfect anarchists. But I think some of the best anarchists that I do know have the humility, the curiosity, and the passion to strive to be better and to embody that ideal to the best of their ability. And as a whole, as a society, as a project, as a human level project, I think anarchy is about constantly pushing to be better, to create systems that produce better outcomes and greater anarchy, to continuously develop the values necessary to maintain that anarchy, to never get complacent, and to let things slide to the point where such authorities can rear their ugly heads once more. Another element of the definition is that call anarchy a world where self-determination, mutuality, and free association form the basis of our society. And I'll explain what those mean. So, self-determination is really basic. It's just the ability of individuals to define and pursue their own paths. It's based on the belief that individually and collectively, we have the capacity or the potential capacity to live and organize ourselves freely in ways that reflect our own needs, desires, and values. It rejects the idea that others, whether they be states, corporations, religious institutions, or any other elites, should have the power to dictate the lives of individuals or impose structures of exploitation and control. Mutuality is a feeling, an action, and a relationship based on shared benefit between individuals and groups in a society. It is reciprocity, communication, a sharing of sentiments, and an exchange of positive actions. And it's not unique to anarchy. We literally saw mutuality in practice just now, right? For those of you who came early or on time, or even a little bit late, you may have seen the mass of people who just descended on the boxes of chairs and started unpacking them and setting them up. Nobody asked anybody to do that. Everybody of their own initiative just picked up and said, I want to be a part of this little project taking place here, this chair setting up project, for everybody's shared benefit, because I think now people have a place to sit. And I'm seeing those that are standing, and I meant to ask, do y'all want to sit? Are y'all seeing any seats available? Because I think we could probably, I don't know if there are any chairs we could pull. People are pointing at available chairs in different parts of the room. So if y'all want to just take a seat, be more comfortable. I'll drink some water again. But yeah, so we're not living in perfect anarchy now, and yet we still experience mutuality in our day-to-day lives. It's a constant. We rely on mutuality to survive and to progress through our day-to-day life. Whether we're working together to set up chairs, to clean the house for Christmas, to troubleshoot a problem in the workplace, to take part in a club or a sport, or to share resources after a natural disaster. Mutuality is something that happens constantly, informally, and often without recognition. If I didn't call out that chair example, you may not have even thought of it as an example. But the concept of mutuality, I think, is really potent and very vital to understanding anarchy, and so it's important we break it down. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of mutual aid. Mutual aid is one component of mutuality. It's the voluntary and mutually beneficial exchange of services and resources in a society. It's where we take responsibility for one another as members of a society and build social relations that sharpen our ability to collaborate and share. Think of something you've done recently to help a neighbor or a friend. You may have cooked for them, or coordinated childcare duties, or been a shoulder to cry on, or shared the products of your labor, whatever they may be. And those are just many examples of mutual aid in action. But outside of mutual aid, and mutual aid gets talked about a lot, there are other components of mutuality. Mutual responsibility is, I think, an under-discussed component and a very vital aspect of how we relate to each other. Mutual responsibility in the anarchist context is the idea that when society is no longer bound by authority, is no longer enforced by the laws of authority, that we have a responsibility for each other to assess the consequences of our actions, take accountability and responsibility for our actions, and to act accordingly, to observe how our actions affect others, and to find ways to resolve the conflicts between our actions and the actions of others, so that we can maintain a degree of social harmony. Tied to that is the idea of mutual understanding, the idea that we formulate norms of behavior that guide the interaction between individuals and groups, that we work to facilitate consultation and negotiation, that we restrain the escalation of conflict. And I don't want to call anything out here because I'm new to this place, but I know there's quite a lot of Portland activist drama and stuff, right? But I played a thing or two. But I really think it's important that we find ways to butt heads productively, that we find ways to, I guess, chafe, or to maybe not be compatible, or to maybe disagree, or to have different approaches, different ways of doing things, but to still have a degree of common ground and mutual respect and understanding, that, we may not like each other necessarily, but, we're going to do this for the collective good. We're going to do this for this project, or we're going to find ways to make this work. And if that's not possible, then being able to step away and say, hey, I don't like you, you don't like me. Let's walk our separate ways into the sunset, right? And then finally, another aspect of mutuality is this idea of mutual defense, right? Because it's in all of our interests to minimize the potential harm of our actions upon others and to proactively seek out solutions to both potential and actual conflict, that we look for ways to stand up for ourselves and for each other. Conflict can be very productive if we let it. It can also cause a lot of harm. And personally, I care about preventing harm to myself and to others. I don't know anybody who enjoys harm unless it's in a very safe and consensual context. But really, in seeing ways that people step up for each other, I think that mutual defense is something that's just emergent from that desire to prevent things from escalating, to prevent threats to our being and to the social harmony that we are trying to maintain. Of course, there are many obstacles to our mutuality. It's a really beautiful concept, but it's definitely restricted under the system by prejudice, by propaganda, by socioeconomic systems, by material conditions. You know, the systems, the prejudices and systems of racism and of sexism, of ableism, of xenophobia, of homophobia, of transphobia, all of these impose boundaries on who we consider parts of our group. And that often, unfortunately, limits people's willingness to extend care, to extend solidarity and cooperation. Propaganda, of course, also limits our capacity to imagine mutuality as an organizing principle. So much of our media and our narratives is this idea of dog eat dog, like people are just ruthless towards each other at all times. And while conflict of that nature makes a really good story, it is not all that we are capable of being. In fact, it's not all that most of us embody in our day-to-day lives. Privatization is another component that restricts our mutuality. I often marvel at the ideas people have, the projects they attempt to pursue, and so often the limiting factor is just space. Having a place to be, having a place to achieve that project. It is a travesty. It is the death of community life that we do not have commons, that we don't have spaces like land and water that we are all able to just exist on and thrive within. And that the creation of that scarcity of space and of resources, it limits our practice of mutuality because now it's like, oh, I have to take care of my own. Oh, I need to have a place for myself. I need to take care of myself, and it's restricting our ability to enjoy abundance in common and as a community. Capitalism also forces us into a lot of exploitative relationships. Wage labor is a very major one, and it replaces a lot of what the system does is it replaces practices and relationships that undergird human society. It replaces it with transactions, with exchanges of commodities, with treats that soothe the discontent that we may experience just living in this life. And it commodifies so much of what community was meant to meet. It turns a lot of basic human needs also into just profit-driven markets. Statism, it also creates a lot of dependence on institutions that really just take the place of what our mutuality would have historically functioned to replace. The whole reason that we needed to develop systems of welfare in the first place was, for one, through the organizing efforts of workers in the trade union movement historically, but for two, because they had to organize that because the systems that they would have developed, the mutual aid societies that a lot of.
I think your microphone's like drifting away.
Oh yeah, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, a lot of the systems of care and the communities that would have, the villages that would have cared for people's needs was stripped away in that very violent process that we call the Industrial Revolution. And so, because we were stripped away from communal life, stripped away from community, stripped away from relationships, and have had all that replaced with commodities, we've had to rely on the state to step in to engage in, providing things like healthcare, or to engage in providing housing and that sort of thing. Things that communities were very easily meeting for themselves in the ways that they knew how prior to the, violent imposition of these systems. And I often speak of these things. I don't want to make it seem like I'm overly romanticizing the past, because I for one, I really appreciate vaccines and antibiotics and indoor plumbing and all those different things, right? But I personally don't see the necessary and inevitable connection between these comforts and these innovations and all the other bad that gets tied up with it as well. I think we can have our toilets and also have freedom. You know, I think we can. Yeah. Also, another thing that sort of limits our mutuality, and I've noticed it particularly in the American political scene, because I have to say I'm really impressed by the level of surveillance that y'all have. Like, it's bravo, Silicon Valley and White House. They did their job. Because it's unfortunate that so much of our informal cooperation, particularly when it's targeted towards certain groups, is criminalized. I've heard of people who have been arrested or fined for just engaging in mutual aid efforts for migrants or homeless people. This idea that, how dare you see a fellow human as a human? Like, go straight to jail, do not pass go, do not collect $200. Like, that's a tragedy. But it's an unfortunate reality, the way that these systems have been set up. I think also our urban design has been, very isolating, which is really ironic, because historically cities were convergences of people, and yet the way the cities are set up today makes it really hard to form bonds of trust and solidarity. It's where you're surrounded by people, and yet so many just feel alone and starve for connection. You pass probably millions of people, well, maybe not millions of people, but hundreds of people or thousands of people every day, and yet so many are just like, wow, I feel so alone. And the way that all of this, from the urban design to the statism, the surveillance, the capitalism, the privatization, the propaganda, and the prejudices, all of these suppress the full potential of our mutuality. And so I understand that it can be difficult to imagine the possibility of our mutuality, or the way that anarchy can work in practice, because we've gotten so accustomed to the way these systems are, and we've gotten so rusty in our practice of freedom, so unaccustomed to the full breadth of possibilities that it implies, that it's hard to imagine a way out. But these are actually the exact problems that anarchy seeks to rectify. Once we start with this conscious recognition of the potential of our mutuality, it becomes a matter of expanding our solidarity, establishing and recognizing the bond between all people, creating systems that create higher shared benefit and lower shared harm, things like commons, library economies, which I have a video on my channel, and I'm supposed to be releasing another one, but it's been delayed quite a bit. But creating these sorts of systems where we can start to develop the relationships that help you to understand that I stand to gain from you doing well, and you stand to gain from me doing well. And through that, it's a lot of difficult work to dismantle prejudices, to challenge that propaganda, but it's necessary to create that abundance. And so I think that one of the main things that attracts me to anarchy is that it seeks to reshape how we practice mutuality by building new habits of cooperation that work without rulers. And that starts with the principle of free association, another aspect of mutuality, right? Because it's based on this idea of mutual interests. I have a thing that I'm into, and you have a thing that you're into, and we could converge on that thing. And then you have a thing that you're not into, and I have a thing that I'm into, and we diverge in that sort of interest. Free association is the founding principle of anarchic social organization, and it just refers to your freedom to move around, connect with people, disassociate with other people, without having the impositions of authority. So you can create groups and create projects and create associations that are based around shared interests or desired actions to pursue those interests and actions. And they can be as broad as, getting food, or as niche as curating the traditional Japanese art of wood joinery, right? They can be as global as, fighting climate change, or as local as restoring a river. It can be as long standing as, ensuring that people's homes are heated in the winter, or as short term as putting together an event. And I think what is so dynamic about free association, that principle, is that it's more responsive to the constant evolution of people's needs and people's wants, people's desires at points in time. What's up? Are they bring it closer? Okay, right.
Really hard to hear back there.
Sorry about that. Okay. So, you have groups that may last for a really long time, for decades, or you have groups that may dissolve. You have groups that split and groups that merge, groups that overlap and groups that come into conflict. And they come together and they discuss their disagreements, they discuss their conflicts, they find solutions, they consult with each other to ensure they're not causing harm. In something that crime thinkers call spaces of encounter. And I've really picked up that term because I think it's something that can be created anywhere. It can be created here, right? In this moment, it could be created on the factory floor. It could be created in a farm. It could be created in a school. It could be created in a workplace. Wherever we find ourselves, wherever we have, shared interests or projects or activities, and it doesn't have to be bound to territory. And this is awesome. I have a little brother who is really, autistically interested in Thomas the Tank Engine, and he would love this. Right? But this idea of just having these groups come together is what Kropotkin was talking about when he spoke of communes. Right? In Words of a Rebel, he described what he meant by communes as a fluid collective of individuals and groups, wherever they find themselves, coming together of their own volition and according to their shared interests without being bound to territory. He specifically separated it from the idea of territories as from the idea of communes as territories or territorial agglomerations. We hear communes today and we think, oh, intentional community, or we think, oh, cult. But it doesn't have to be either of those things. And I'm really inspired by how Kropotkin conceived of them as something far more dynamic. And so to sort of wrap up this section, and I've been going for a while because I had a script and I ended up going all over. But, hopefully these concepts give us some of the tools that are necessary to start putting together the pieces. I know anarchy can be difficult to understand. It's something I'm still putting together. The goal of my channel has really been to just learn and explore as much as possible. It's been the tagline since I started it back in 2020. And it's something that I hope that each and every person here can be part of developing and cultivating as we go along. But I need to make a connection here because I've been talking a lot about anarchism. I spent a little bit of time talking about Solarpunk, but we have to make that connection. So with the idea of anarchism in mind, and with the idea of Solarpunk's imaginative potential as a vision to strive towards, how do we bring that together? How do we achieve a Solarpunk anarchy? Right? And you'll notice in the structure of the definition of anarchism, we have a hint in there. Right? I said that anarchism is a political philosophy and practice that opposes all authority along with its justifying dogma and proposes the unending pursuit of anarchy, a world without rule where self-determination, mutuality, and free association form the basis of our society. So you might hear a certain emphasis on oppose and propose, right? And that's what social revolution is about. It's an ongoing, it's an intentional transformation of our society, but it has not necessarily a prescribed end goal, but it's about constantly negating all forms of authoritarianism and prejudice and constantly affirming the freedom of equals. And that starts here now, not at some distant point of revolution with the second coming of Jesus, Marx, Christ, but right here now, through acts of confrontation and non-cooperation, the things you do to oppose the current system. And I'll only speak of legal means here because, again, the visa, right? But things like protests and strikes and boycotts, and then also acts of promotion and prefiguration, the things you do to propose alternative ways of thinking and doing things, through creating and spreading radical media, through mutual aid, through conflict resolution, through free schools, through affinity groups, through alternative economies. People now in this system at this point in time may not be ready to live in anarchy, but they can get ready through practice. And that's where the concept of powers, drives, and consciousness comes in. It's a bit of, it's been a drum I've been beating for a long time, but it derives from this book that I read multiple times called Prefigurative Politics, Building Tomorrow Today, by Paul Riekstad and Sofa Shagradin. And they talk specifically about how we need to understand powers, drives, and consciousness to effect social change. So powers just refers to our abilities and capacities to act, to be, and to experience. It's shaped by both internal powers and external conditions. You need to ride a bike, you need to have both the internal ability to ride a bike, but also access to a bike, right? And the existence of bike lanes, preferably, right? And then, of course, powers are connected to your drives, the motivations, your wishes, your goals, your values, your desires, the things that propel the activity. And as our powers expand, so do our drives. The more we get free, the more we want to get free, right? The more you dance, the better you get at dancing, the more you want to dance, as I've often said. And then finally, with consciousness, it refers to our capacity for reflection and deliberate action. So it enables us to evaluate and adapt to our present circumstances and also imagine and strategize to create a better future. But we have to be careful because if we don't unlearn the biases and prejudices and assumptions of the status quo and actually understand what we profess to believe, what we're trying to achieve and how to get there, then we might spend time and energy and resources pursuing means that will never achieve our desired ends. So to bring things to a close and to get a bit practical, where do we start? How do we create this strive towards anarchy where Solarpunk can flourish? We good?
Yeah, just try to talk closer to the mic.
Okay.
I'm about to put a pillow in your lap so that your elbow doesn't go.
Yeah. I'll prop it up like this.
Yeah, perfect.
Lean a bit to the left.
Left?
Just because I think the feedback is coming.
Okay, yeah. Like this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Don't move.
So, where do we get started, right? Left. Good? I want to look at the people over here as well. I've been neglecting this side. Okay. This is comfortable. So we can start at home by reimagining relationships, the way that we relate to our families, our roommates, our peers, our lovers, whatever the case may be. I'm really very much, I live with children, and so I've always had a great passion for children. I think, it's so trite to say it, but children are the future. And just finding ways to, relate to children that empower them to think critically, to question authority, to not necessarily do what they're told, but to question why they're doing what they're told or why they're being told that. And it can be annoying, and the children have a lot of questions. But I think it's very important that we start there, that we ensure that the way we relate to children sets them up to be the kind of adults that can thrive in egalitarian relationships. That are not set up in ways that accustom them to obedience to authority, and in ways that accustom them to just conforming to the system, and in ways that unfortunately often leave them open to abuse. Also at home, as one practices Solarpunk, I try not to get too much into like individual lifestyles, because that's a very sort of BP PR campaign sort of approach, where it's like, oh, your individual footprint is responsible for climate change. But there are things you can do on the small scale that, if multiple people do that on a small scale, really adds up and it makes a difference. You could grow a garden, you could start a compost, you try and find ways to reduce your waste. You can engage in things like clothing swaps. You could opt for renewable energy sources as much as you can. We have somebody here who's really into making biofuels, so you could probably talk to them, right? And just finding sort of energy saving measures, finding ways to, make use of what you have and to share what you have with others. And just that sort of resource sharing with yourself, with your household, with neighbors, sharing tools, sharing skills, sharing the things that you have. At school, for those who are in college or in high school, I don't know if we have high schoolers here, but, in college, finding these sort of connections with fellow students, whether it be through book clubs or study groups or skill shares that can help to explore some of these ideas, or even outside of the school system, because I really believe that learning should be lifelong. Looking at, creating that sort of DIY curriculum, creating that sort of free school that, people can come to and be a part of. I know there are classes that take place right here in Bridgespace with all sorts of different things. I know, I don't know if it was at Bridgespace or somewhere, I think it was at somewhere else, at Green Anchors, that you were really getting into like bow making and craft and that sort of thing. So there's stuff that are happening where we could continue our education and our sharing of knowledge outside of the traditional schooling structure. Sharing this stuff for ourselves, organizing teachings and that sort of things, thinking about what you have to offer, and what you want to get from others. And we'll get into that practically at the end, of course. And then at work, don't want to like romanticize co-ops, because some of the stuff has been like co-op related difficulties that I've heard, because I've been able to speak to some people who have worked in co-ops, and they've shared some of their experiences. So it's obviously not the golden bullet, the silver bullet. I don't know why I said golden bullet. The silver bullet, the easy solution. But if that is an option for you, finding ways to engage in that sort of work, to sort of try to build up an alternative economy, because as activists and as radicals, we have all these great ideas for projects and things we could do, but we're often limited by resources. And unfortunately, to rectify that outside of, again, things I can't discuss for legal reasons, there are things that we could do to build up our pool of resources and our network of connections, so that we can try and sort of fill the needs that we're lacking. And for those who are not able to engage in cooperatives and that sort of thing, of course, there's also great value, even if it's not going to necessarily lead to an anarchist syndicalist future immedately, engaging in things like union organizing to at least make your life more livable, to give you, better working conditions, shorter working hours, and just more autonomy. Even if it's something as simple as being able to work from home and fighting for that right to work from home, so that you could log in, go back to sleep, and get back into it later on, that sort of thing. I think one of the great tragedies of this sort of approach we have to work and to capitalism and that sort of thing is I mean, obviously, all the exploitation and stuff sucks, but I think one of the main issues for me is just the amount of time that it sucks up. And when you add a commute on top of that, it makes it even more horrendous. And so, just finding ways to at least claw back some of our time in the interim, and then using that time, now that we've reclaimed that time to, for one, rest and to sort of get into ourselves and to understand ourselves. But then for two, to use that time to give back to our communities, to engage in the kind of work that can wrestle even more free time away from the system. And I think that is particularly valuable. It's oftentimes it can be a matter of making perfect the enemy of good, or of looking at projects or ideas or practices or solutions and saying, well, that's not enough. That's not going to solve everything, or that's not going to, create a revolution overnight necessarily. But even if it's not necessarily a path towards getting out of this system, I think it's still at least a path for making this system more livable, so that we can pursue those other paths to make our lives more livable and to break out of this shell. Lastly, in community, I want to ensure, and in movements, I want to ensure that we are engaging in, to provide suggestions rather, to ensure that we're engaging in things like food sharing programs, free stores, community fridges, skill shares, community gardens, water systems or mesh networks that can operate independently of the state, developing the sort of relationships and infrastructure that can, when stuff hits the fan, we have that to fall back on, and that can eventually, if a situation of collapse, serve as the foundation of an entirely new system and structure. Also, I'm sure there are many artists in this audience, and so I want to take the time to shout out the artists, because for many of you, your first encounter with Solarpunk might have been a piece of art, or a poem, or a story, or a video. And the capitalists, the statists, the authorities, they understand the value of shaping and managing culture, of dictating the cultural imagination. And so we may not have the amount of resources that they do to create, multi-billion-dollar franchises and media houses and all these different things, but we can still, in our own ways, create and share art and media that can inspire people to imagine a future that is sustainable and just, and that shows practical pathways to get there. So through these practices, I believe the future can be what we make it. What we do now in this moment is what will make the difference. I believe that Solarpunk inspires our imagination, and anarchism grounds our actions, and then social revolution connects the two. So when we realize that we collectively can actively create change, we will flourish. Through the narrative and nature-fueled imagination of Solarpunk, the practical philosophy of anarchy, and the ongoing process of social revolution, I believe we can build the systems and relationships that will get us through even the worst crises and steer us toward a future that is so much better. I want you to imagine a Solarpunk world of flourishing communities, ecological harmony, and true freedom. And I believe that together, we can make it real. Thank you. Good question. Was this like half past already? What time are we supposed to end?
We started late, it's totally fine.
Okay.
Yeah, we got some time. You could always say acknowledge that we're going to path.
What is you want?
I think if people want to do a Q&A. Oh, you want a Q&A? That's cool.
Okay, so we could go late.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I don't think we're...
Okay, nice. And I think this is also the value of third places and having these sorts of relationships with people, because this was supposed to end in like 3 minutes, but because of the relationship we have with the owner of this space, we're going late. So shout out to you. So we have time for questions, but also I don't necessarily want this, like I said in the beginning, I don't want this to be the Andrew Sage late night show. I want this to be involving everybody. So I will take some questions, but then I'm gonna ask y'all some questions, and we're gonna try and find a way to do that in a way that makes sense, because I don't think I was expecting this many people, but we'll make it work.
Can I just announce one thing really quick?
Sure, I'll guess no.
So I have a sign-up sheet for people that are interested in doing a Solarpunk art club here at Bridgespace. So if you have to leave early and you want to sign up, you can just come over to me and put your number, and then after the questions, we'll have a piece of paper right here, and you can just come write your signal number. And yeah, it's just a Solarpunk club where we're gonna make really cool art and make Solarpunk real.
Awesome. So I'm seeing a hand there. Let's start there. What's up?
I just want to make a little shout out. You mentioned you're a guy who cares about children in the future. I'm a neurodivergent guy who also cares about children in the future. So many capitalist authority figures have tried to make me feel like I'm a piece of garbage because I care about kids. I'm glad, let those people know. There are many good men out there who care about the future. We're not all pieces of garbage, and let's stub our nose and fight for that free association we're waiting for the future.
All right, yeah. Shout out to all of those who care for children and care for the future that children represent. I'm seeing another hand over there.
I was wondering if it seems to you that a protopian, anarcho-solarpunk future is necessarily moving in the trajectory of post-ownership and post-transaction.
That's a good question. So they're asking if I think that a solarpunk anarchist future is one that is post-ownership and post-transaction. What I find interesting, so we typically, when we talk about, when we're sort of breaking down and explaining anarchism to people, we say, there's private property and personal property, and we're not coming for your toothbrush or your house, but, this idea that people can derive profit from just having a piece of paper that says they own something is something that we are kind of pushing back against. Anarchism kind of got its start when some guy, at least as a consciously written down political philosophy, it got its start when some guy in the 19th century was like, property is theft, right? So when we speak of ownership and that connection with anarchism, I think it's sort of investigating those roots. In terms of moving, I'm still trying to figure this thing out. In terms of moving post-ownership, I think that the way that we relate to things and possessions or whatever is definitely something that would move less towards this idea of having a right to a thing and more towards this idea or a piece of paper that says you have a right to a thing. My ear feels so much better now. Yeah, okay, so I have less feedback and stuff now. That's brilliant. Okay, could have done that from the beginning. But yeah, so just sort of, I think, moving away from this idea that this right or this privilege or this, pre-designated connection to things, and recognizing or moving towards a relationship with things based on use and negotiation. That when somebody's occupying a space, that we recognize that none of this land is anybody's own. If anything, the land owns us, and so just finding ways to figure out, because nobody has any more right to a space than another, we have to find ways to just sort of resolve those sorts of conflicts, to figure out solutions, to share where necessary. Sometimes things might be sign-up sheet-based, or sometimes things might be, this person is using this space, or this group is using this space for this purpose, and we respect that. And so I think relating to these things and these spaces based on use, more so than the right of property or the rights ascribed by a deed of ownership, is what we can, I think, expect. Of course, this is speculation. I mean, I'm not some time traveler from an anarchist future, but I do like to speculate about what is possible where that is concerned. And regarding transactions and moving post-transactions, there are a lot of conversations about it in anarchist circles, of course, and it's not something that I really have like a solid answer on, because I was really opposed to money for a really long time. And recently I've stumbled upon some interesting ideas related to things like local currencies or like use-based currencies or whatever the case may be. And I haven't like fully investigated those ideas yet. I'm still learning about them, so I can't really speak much on them. But because I'm still investigating that, I have to say I'm agnostic to the idea of, in terms of if you're talking about transaction, the sense of money, I'm kind of agnostic to the idea of, how that relates to, I guess, my personal vision of the project. Okay, got a hand here.
Aside from, of course, just like getting involved in organizations and communities, what would you say like some of the most important actions are in the now, or moving towards an anarchist solarpunk world?
Sorry,
You want me to say that?
aside from
just like getting involved in communities and organizations.
well, I think aside from
I mean, every action will be done.
yeah, well, I think aside from the sort of maybe the sort of in-person involved community work you're referring to.
I mean, like with those communities, I guess. What would you say the best actions we can take as communities and organizations in the now, aside from the simple act of joining them? What would you say the best and most important actions to take right now are?
The person is asking what I think the best and most important actions to take right now in communities and in projects, in movements and stuff are. And I don't think that's a question I necessarily have the answer to. I think the best thing to do is really situational. It's really in the moment. It's kind of something you have to decide for yourself what you are capable of, what you have the capacity for, what you could bring to the table. I think, of course, it's necessary to be in conversation and to take a look at the situation and say, for example, ICE is knocking down people's doors. What can I do to help my undocumented neighbors? That is probably really vital work right now to get involved in. If you're looking for like a specific recommendation or example, I don't know if that helps.
There's a workshop on that specific thing on Wednesday.
Okay, Cora Sage is telling me there's a workshop on that specific idea of.
Like on. There is a workshop about just like I didn't read the thing very well, but navigating ICE, like trying to swipe people and how to be an ally to keeping people safe. And it's on Wednesday. I can get you that information if you care about that.
There we go. Okay, I'm seeing two hands here. Me get red shirt first. And I'll get you after. Right after, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood. I thought that during my episode was work.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, you can find Core Sage. You can stand up and show people.
Hi.
So you can find Core Sage and they'll tell you what's up. So there's a question.
Hopefully not too rambling here. This is a big question. There's going to be a social thing after this, so maybe we can do discussion groups for this. But I really, really try to think about, the divisiveness that is in America. It's pretty regionally separated, but I mean, it's happening everywhere. How do we people that just completely disagree.
Right.
One of the pieces that I kind of thought of is like unions are pretty supported across political spectrums, but I'm having trouble seeing more than that. So,
Okay.
rambling.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I think the gist of your question is you want to know how to connect and across like division, political division, and also how to work with people who sort of disagree with some of your core tenets. I think two aspects of it to me are, for one, maybe three. I want to break this down. Okay, so one aspect of it I think is start with the people who agree. You know, there's already like so much. There's already so much work that could still be done with the people who are already on this in this sort of sphere in this sort of space. As sort of early adopters, I think there's a lot of work that we can still do that could be a benefit, and which leads into sort of point number two, which is that in doing that work, we demonstrate an example, an attractive example. You know, oftentimes, what is the thing that causes people to oppose? It may be that they can't imagine the feasibility of such a thing, or they are lashing out in frustration at the system, but they are misdirecting that frustration towards marginalized groups, and so just sort of finding ways to demonstrate that, okay, well, you could be in your little rage bubble if you want, or we have like ice cream and pizza here, and we doing a nice little block party or whatever, and we're sharing food and groceries, and you could be a part of this. You had to chill out with the prejudice. You can't come in and start like cussing on people and throwing around slurs. But if you're willing to like be chill, and we'll sort of work through people's issues that way. Of course, the tricky part I think is working with the fact that so many people that in working with those sorts of people who have those kinds of political antagonisms, you can often end up sacrificing the marginalized groups and making them feel unsafe or unheard or endangered. And so I think from the outside perspective, I think there's a lot of obsession with like just trying to get like, I don't know, like trying to bring in white Trump supporters into the fold and getting them involved and stuff. And not to say that you should write off those people entirely, they are still humans at the end of the day. But I think it's very important to prioritize the people who are most affected by the actions. And in prioritizing those people and how they're affected, you can get a lot more out of it. I'd say get a lot more in the sense that rather than expending a ton of energy trying to get people who are not seeing or are not opposed to all the messed up stuff that's happening, you try and connect with and act in solidarity with the people who are seeing that, the people who are the most affected by that. And in that solidarity, you have that kind of support to create the sort of actions and to create the sort of change that can eventually, by example, bring those others around. But I think your priority should really be with, standing with the marginalized, standing with the people who are most affected by these systems, because I think you'll find a lot more loyalty and solidarity and community building in that, rather than chasing after. And I know it's difficult because for a lot of people, it's like, that's my family, that's my brother or my sister or my father or my mother or my uncle or whatever. And it's really difficult because it's like, it's disappointing. It's sad and it's disheartening to see that they've gone down this path of hatred. And to be honest with you, where the sort of navigating family aspect of things is concerned, I don't have a fully fleshed out solution. But I would say, like, I think it's to the extent that your capacity allows, to try and be that good example for them, or to be that sort of beacon, that light, that thing that can sort of attract them, because they have that relationship with you, you know. So it's more so about calling them in rather than calling them out, you know, because I think they're going to be more willing to listen to you because they have a relationship with you versus a complete stranger trying to tell them like what's what. And I know it like emotions can run really high, and that's why I say to the extent that your capacity allows, because sometimes you need to step back and say, hey, you know, I love you, but I can't do this right now. But to the extent that your capacity allows, I think it's really vital to not necessarily fight them down, but to find ways to demonstrate to them the grace and love and the potential of, you know, these ideas that we represent and we try to share and we try to propagate, and hopefully by that connection something can change. And so that was a really rambly answer, but I hope it helped somewhat. I'm gonna look over on this side now because I'm like neglecting this side. So I see a hand over there.
I was wondering about, sort of similar to the last question actually, just navigating some interpersonal relationships with people as anarchists. It seems that oftentimes people jump to the assumption that anarchists are all about violence, or about chaos, or about throwing malls on cocktails. I wonder how we can break that association and like show people that what we're really about is community and really helping each other.
That's fantastic. So they're basically asking, how do we break that association with anarchism and Molotov cocktails and chaos and that sort of thing? I think by showing up. A lot of the people who have the association with anarchism being chaos and violence, Molotov cocktails, they may not have necessarily met an anarchist. They may not have had the experience of an anarchist like showing up and sharing food or caring for them or bringing groceries or whatever the case may be. And I think one of the, like, it's very easy to get into sort of like intellectual stuff. You're like, have to explain, no, actually, you know, anarchism is a 19th century political philosophy. And it's like, you could get into that. And for some people, that's appealing. But I think for a lot more people, it's like just experiencing being around anarchists and realizing, you know, these are just people who care very deeply about people. And just showing that care for people, I think, is going to be some of the most vital work that you do in sort of shifting that perception. And all of us have a role to play in helping to shift that perception. I think people and communities who are familiar with anarchists can often say that, you know, these people, they've stood up, you know, they've fought back against the police, they've shielded us from tear gas or from violence. And of course, there are mistakes and hiccups, and there are often points of contention and times when anarchists fail in that regard. But I think when anarchists do show themselves to be stand in solidarity with various movements, do show themselves to be caring for people, that perception will go away. And there's a hand behind you. What's up? What's that?
Your interpretation of prefiguration, if it's not too risky.
My interpretation of prefiguration, I mean, it's mostly what I would have shared, just building the new in the shell of the old, or attempting to establish some vision of the relationships and systems that we want to see and want to live within. What's up?
So, this is a question related to a couple questions that was going to be original. I was actually curious if you were going to touch at it at any point in answering those two questions, but I know that one of your dearest identities to you is as a writer, and that your background is in mass communications. And I was curious if there was anything that you wanted to think about or share in regard to flexibility of terminology when dealing with folks who are from a different background. Folks that I would often describe as being more likely to be engaged in solidarity, you know, and like an example of this, I went to a wedding in northern Idaho, which is, for most of us, has a bit of a cultural connotation of not being engaged with.
You know what, since you're right here, I want to give you the mic.
Okay.
So I ended up going to a wedding in northern Idaho, and for those of us who have lived in the Pacific Northwest, that comes with a bit of a connotation of definitely not being engaged overtly in Solarpunk ideals. And what was interesting to observe was the generations in the wedding. The youngest were listening to Jordan Peterson and some of those folks, and the next eldest were engaged thoroughly in being part of the sheriff's department and some of that sort of thing. But then Mima in the corner said, I don't trust no police and I don't trust no politicians, and they will take my grandpappy still when they pry their shotgun from my fingers. And I'm like, get it, Mima. You know? And so there is this anti-authoritarian streak in, yeah, there you go.
I was like
There you go. But there is something there. And I feel like a lot of what we bring into those spaces is a visual identity and a terminology system that they have been trained to immediately disengage with or react to antagonistically. And so I'm curious from your perspective, what are some potential strategies or some explorations around that?
Are you talking like code switching for anarchy?
Yeah, it sounds a bit like you're asking about code switching, and I think for me, the sort of answer that I was thinking of, because that's something I'm also still trying to figure out myself, right? But what I often get back to when I think about that sort of question in my day-to-day life is just tapping into the culture and the history of the people that you're talking to. So for me, right, coming from Trinidad and Tobago, there's a history of obviously resistance to enslavement and indentureship and colonialism and all these different things. Our cultural celebration that is known across the world, Carnival, is that. It's been commodified and commercialized now, but it started as a rejection of the colonial order, as a celebration and protest all in one. And so I think when I'm speaking to Trinis, my fellow Trinidadians, I often draw upon our history of Carnival and our history of resistance, or even broadly, our Caribbean history of maroonage, of escaping the plantation, of finding escape, of finding resistance, of finding new ways and new systems of doing things. And I think when you connect to people's ancestors, in a sense, that I think they already exist in cultural connections. I think that does something a bit more in their willingness to challenge or to hear out new ideas. So from what I'm familiar with, I haven't been to the Midwest or to Idaho. Is Idaho in the Midwest? No.
It's right next to us.
Okay.
Iowa, Idaho.
Okay. It's considered part of the Pacific Northwest. Okay. Yeah, I could. U.S. states, I'm still working on it, right?
Don't feel obliged.
No, I do feel obliged. I'm constantly on Cetera, on geography games, like click, trying to identify every country and
That one,
everything.
Indiana.
Yeah. I always remember Kentucky because it's shaped like a piece of chicken.
Yeah.
But right. But yeah. So for me, I'm not like accustomed to that particular cultural context. I'm familiar with it, with the sort of what you called yolidarity, right? Right. So I'm not familiar with that kind of yolidarity, but what I will say is that I do know there is a history of trade union resistance and of that sort of anti-authoritarian struggle that happens in a lot of these sort of small towns that could be tapped into. Of course, that it only gets you so far. It often only gets you into like a kind of a class dimension of it. But I think, as I was telling the other person, when it comes to the relationship that you have with the person, you can, I think, tap into their willingness to hear you out potentially, to draw that connection between class solidarity and interracial solidarity and you know, anti-patriarchal solidarity, all these different things that could also, but I don't have a full answer to that.
They love the word fellowship instead of
Fellowship. I'm seeing two hands all the way in the back. I'll do the one to the left and then the one to the right. My left.
What's your ideal eco-punk, solar punk, whatever, fiction? What does it involve?
My ideal eco-punk or solarpunk fiction. What would it involve? Well, that's a fun question.
Yeah, I had a more serious one, but
No, that's cool. I think it's a story I was actually working on for a really long time. It was like this kind of archipelagic, alternate Caribbean setting where I took all of the cultural and architectural and fashion and technological influences of all the cultures that make up Trinidad and Tobago and the broader Caribbean, and use that to kind of construct a solarpunk society. And the story I was going to tell, I think it was going to be a classic get to the MacGuffin tales or, quests across the islands or something like that. But the law I was developing for it would have had, this basically different types of anti-authoritarian resistance involving the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, involving the East Indians who would have come to the Caribbean as indentured laborers, but in my setting, they came as like this massive migration. Of course, having like a different take on the transatlantic trade, where instead of it being a trade of peoples, it was just a trade of ideas and a more consensual and voluntary, movement of peoples, and also drawing inspiration from various Chinese and other East Asian influences, because all those populations make up the vibrant island that I hail from. And so I think for me, a really ideal solarpunk story would be one that draws upon in different ways, all of the cultures that each have their own covered or uncovered history of resistance to authority. Seen a hand over there? Yeah, what's up?
Just curious if you have read anything recently that you would recommend that you found like inspiring or interesting for the last year or so.
In the last year or so, the person's asking what I've read recently that I might find inspiring in the last year or so that I could recommend. I'm gonna pull up my Goodreads. Give me a second. Oh no, it's not a public Goodreads. So many embarrassing books on there, to be honest. I don't need you all to know how long it took me to read Dune. Oh no, okay, All About Love by Bell Hooks. Loved it. I think it was the first book I read last year. For some reason,
Mazel tov.
I think you're good. You don't have to use your hands. There's a broom and scoop in the kitchen. You could probably use, you don't have to cut yourself. Okay, cool. It took me a long time to read it, but I really loved At the Cafe by Enrico Malatesta. It's this brilliant series of like short conversations about anarchism between like these fictional characters that Malatesta came up with. And to me, it was like the most creative way that I had encountered so far to just like share anarchist ideas. And he's done quite a few dialogues, not just that book, but also others. And it inspired me to start writing my own series of dialogues that might turn into a book. Right? And also James E. Scott's 2 Chairs for Anarchism. It's a really fun, like, just set of like explorations of different concepts. Worship in Power, an anarchist view of early state formation by Peter Gallalus was also really fun to read, just looking at all these different cultures and their histories, all the different ways that states formed, and all the ways that also they were resisted. And yeah, those are some of the stuff I've read last year and in recent times that have really inspired and appealed to me. The last one was, sorry, I already forgot. Worship and Power by Peter Delary, or Belarus. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. There's a question.
I'm curious about, now that you're headed back, what ideas will you take back to your cultural context, and how will you, like what you've learned here, how will you shape it to your own cultural context?
Brilliant question. The person asked, what have I gathered from being here in Portland that I'm going to take back to my cultural context and how I'm going to develop it? So I experienced the 3 days of the Rewilding Conference, and it was structured in a really fantastic way. So the first day was just a series of talks, myself included in those talks. And then the second day was this practice called open spaces. And it's just this way of kind of just sharing ideas in a very dynamic format where you have like an hour, and people at the beginning of the day, we all came up with different ideas for sessions that we wanted to have. And the people who came up with those ideas would host those sessions, but they didn't have to host it in the sense of knowing everything about it. They might just say, I don't know anything about this, but if anybody else knows anything about it and they want to talk about it with me, I'm going to have this session at this corner of the room at this time. And so it was about, I think, 5 sessions or session days, sessions, and multiple locations. There were multiple sessions happening at once, and there were like different ways of doing it. So you had where you would just sit down and do one session, or you had like, you might bumblebee between sessions and not settle, something I did a bit of as well. Or you might butterfly and exist in the liminal space between sessions and have like conversation on the side. And that was just mind-blowing to me. I mean, the third day we went and we shoveled dirt on a farm. We got to basically dig into the soil and turn it over. And that was my experience with frost and ice and stuff being in soil. And so it made me really grateful for not having to deal with that. Really a newfound appreciation. But at the same time, I can't step outside for like more than a couple minutes without sweating every drop of water in my being out. So, there's trade-offs. So that experience was really cool, and then coming back and talking and stuff after. But to me, the open spaces portion of it was the most impactful for me. It's difficult because when I came to Portland, I knew Portland was like the weird city, the activist city, the space, the hopping space for activists, and unfortunately also activist drama. But it was, I knew I was coming into a situation that had a lot more of a developed projects, developed networks, developed relationships, a history of activism that is still active to this day, things that are going on all over the city. Unfortunately, in my cultural context, in Trinidad and Tobago, a lot of the activists, the height of the activist scene really was all the way back in 1970 with the attempted Black Power Revolution that was shut down unceremoniously. And since then, it's kind of hard to even track down some of those elders who were involved in that. A lot of the networks and groups that were part of it, or even are currently doing activism, it's kind of hard to find them. They're not often in the public eye or in the radar to say you could just like walk up to them. So for me, it's finding those relationships and also sort of reinventing the wheel or starting from scratch in some ways of building up that sort of infrastructure. But even before building up some of that infrastructure, engaging in the kind of ideological and political education that is lacking because of, for example, and this is something you may take for granted, being on an island, getting books is kind of difficult. So to say, for example, that you'll have this really brilliant bookstore I went to recently, Revolution's bookstore, right? Beautiful place. I could have cried, right? But being there, I was like, wow, because you don't really have the bookstores we have in Trinidad. They're obviously, because of the cost associated with importing books, they can't really take risks on books they don't know people are going to buy or not, and also they probably don't want to import radical materials. So a lot of people aren't exposed to a lot of those ideas. So they have the internet to be exposed to them, but sometimes, it's a matter of like walking past a bookstore and seeing something that catches your eye, or getting in a conversation with somebody in a bookstore, or
getting a recommendation or picking up a zine, a free zine or something that gets you on your journey. But a lot of that is lacking, and the sort of thing to say where you could just step in and start and be a part of a group that already exists and get that kind of experience and stuff is not quite there in a lot of places yet. And particularly because of the education, the lack of access to some of the books that are really important, and also the political climate of Trinidad is very different from the American context in some ways, and unfortunately very similar in other ways. But the main thing is that our two main political parties, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of Trinidad history, but our two main political parties are pretty much ethnic based, they're not ideologically based. So a lot of ideological and politically radical stuff kind of needs to get in there and shake things up. And so I was looking forward to bring it back. I was looking for a way to start some of those conversations. I wanted to have an event and start having events to try and bring in together the people there and getting some of those discussions going. And hopefully ensuring that people could find each other, because that's been really difficult so far for me. But I wasn't sure how I was gonna go about it. And so experiencing open spaces was the missing piece of the puzzle. I'm just eureka, I know how I'm gonna do this now. So that was the most impactful thing for me.
Let's start up the Trinity Zine.
The Trinity Zine, yeah.
We can ship you boxes.
I'd appreciate that. Anybody who's willing to send stuff, I'd appreciate that as well. So I'm not seeing any hands. So if there aren't any hands, it's time for me to ask some open questions. And you can answer it amongst the neighbors, or you can answer it out loud, or I'm not sure how I want to do this, or you can just answer it within yourself, or think about it as you go where you need to go, or go about your day. You can ask yourself, I'll just read out the questions and you can give it some thought. But what is, some small way that you could bring Solarpunk into your life today? Or how can we start creating and sharing Solarpunk stories to inspire hope and action? Or what are some, I guess this one is more practical, I'll write it down, but what are some ongoing projects in Portland that you are part of, or that you know of, that you think others here could take part in? And if you want to volunteer those, I'm not sure if we could have a sheet for that as well, where we could take down those projects and people could write them down and maybe put in a contact and that kind of thing. I see a hand raised.
There's a bulletin board back there with a couple of events, and then I think I go a card with somebody's got a website for a PDX mutual aid hub.
Oh yeah, there's a website on there specifically that has a list of 50+ mutual aid groups in Portland. So go check out the bulletin board, and specifically want to plug one of those events on February 1st. If you're into food sovereignty and anything related to food justice, on Saturday there's going to be a big network plug-in event to meet up with those folks.
Also, we're going to erase the whiteboard. I got permission. Hopefully, when they'll show me that Thunder, you can erase the whiteboard and make that. Yay, Rob.
Okay, erasing.
Thunder, could you erase the whiteboard and set that up for folks to write their stuff on too, so we can note photographs of the whiteboard. Please handwrite the resources so they'll get digitized and AI'd and whatever. We don't know where those end up. So their accessibility needs our photographs, I understand, but if possible, please handwrite those.
Yeah. So for those who didn't hear, there's a bulletin board in the back, and there's also going to be a whiteboard where you could go and write down projects and stuff that you are part of.
We also have a community kombucha thing happening back here. Kombucha.
It tastes really good. It's really, really good. So go and have some. Another thing, I don't know if we could split the whiteboard in half, but another thing I wanted to do was sort of find out if you have skills or resources that you are willing to offer to others who are here. You could put that in one column.
We have 2 whiteboards.
Okay, there are 2 whiteboards. Brilliant. Right? So you could put down your name or contact, whatever, what you are willing to share, resources or skill-wise. And then also maybe in another column, if you have something that you need, a resource that you're lacking in or a skill that you're desiring to pick up or whatever the case may be, you could go and write that down there as well and hopefully sort of connect those offers and needs. So, oh, I see a hand. What's
I was
up?
gonna say exactly what you just did. I recently made a poster in my community of just like, hey, if you want to get into community organizing, text the signal number, and now we have like 10 neighbors that we didn't know before who have exactly that list that you
Awesome.
just put up there of like, here's what I can offer, here's what I need, and here's emergency phone numbers because we're all queer and we don't talk to our family.
That's awesome. So, another quick question. Oh, come on.
I do, and I encourage others to do, is you live somewhere where you have any space you can grow things for free. I do an annual Friendsgiving, I call it, or the day before Thanksgiving. I have lunch beer folk over. It's very tricky. Have people come and bring food. I would encourage anyone who has that space to make that space open. Compassion in general. Do those weird little things that bring yourself joy by bringing others joy. Cook for them.
Good for them, yes.
Yes, indeed. The way to my heart is definitely through the kitchen. So, this person was just sharing the appeal to, if you have the space and the capacity to, do a Friendsgiving of your own, to do a sharing of food of your own, if you have space to grow food and to share with others, and I 100% condone. So at this point, I pretty much said my piece. I know some people have had to leave, and also I know we're going to eventually go and hang in the High Latte Cafe. But we also have some time here to just mingle and chat and stuff. I highly recommend, make a connection with a neighbor, talk to a cool person that you see. There's a lot of cool people here, so, let's make something out of this. Because I'm not going to be here, but, these are your neighbors, so, yeah. Thank you also, thank you. I just wanted to thank everybody for being here and for showing up. It's just been a really a blessing and an honor